Hello again. This is the muffler design that I came up with for the lower exhaust pipes on the RZ 500 pipe project. It's an 8-inch tube with a longer inner tube perforated with holes. It's basically a design that I came up using the MH Aero Tools software for designing mufflers. And this is the way the lower one turned out. The tubes are brazed to the end plates, and then the end plate and the side ring are brazed together like that. And the whole thing after it's packed with fiberglass will have 4 rivets equally spaced on the front and the back. Here's a picture of the drawing, the design for the lowers. And this is the long baffle tube for the lower muffler. And this is what the upper silencer looks like. And that's what the baffle plates look like. Okay, now I'm going to show you how we put these pieces together. Each one of these discs has a ring which gets brazed like so. And that's what allows it to fit inside the tube. There's rivets at 4 points that'll hold it into the tube. Also, before we do that, we mount that on there at the right depth, braze that first, then we do the ring, and then we'll do the same thing on the other end here. I wanted to show you, this is the brazing rod that I'm using. It's called Aladdin 3-in-1. It's a brazing rod. It melts at 732 degrees, which should be just fine for these mufflers. I really don't think that exhaust gas could even come close to getting that hot at the end of the pipe. So it should work just fine. It's easy to use. Just need a propane torch, and I'll show you how I do it. One of the first things you have to do is the metal has to be clean. Use a stainless steel brush, and one that you only use for aluminum. Never brush steel with it, otherwise it'll embed steel into the aluminum. And you have to brush it so it's nice and bright. Even if it's brand new stuff, there's still an aluminum oxide layer on there. And aluminum oxide is a big pain in the butt. It melts at 3,000 degrees. Aluminum melts at like 1,200 degrees. So if you ever tried working with aluminum before, you know once you start heating it up, it gets that shiny look to it, and then it turns to a blob and falls on the floor. But the skin is the oxide that you can see, and it will not melt until it hits 3,000, which is way after the aluminum is turned to junk. So the first thing you have to do is make sure you brush it really well. This one I already brushed a couple days ago. Didn't get back to doing the video again, so we're going to brush it again. Make sure it's nice and bright. Okay. So next, let me get this held in the vise in the position it needs to be raised. One of the disadvantages, I think, of this rod compared to welding you can get a tack wherever you need it, and then come back and weld it out. This material here, it doesn't really lend itself well to tacking, which means you have to make sure that your material is clamped in a way so that it can't move while you're working it, because the whole joint will become liquid. At least working on a circle, you might only just have maybe a half of the joint, because you have to move your torch to both sides. On a straight line joint, it's all going to stay liquid. So you have to make sure whatever you've got clamping this stays still. I've got this big slab of steel sitting right here, perched on top of it to hold it. I have to be real careful so I don't knock it over. But That's about the only drawback I can see to using this rod. You have to really be careful with your jigging, and it's got to be held firmly. Once it sets up and it solidifies, you're good to go. And this is how we're going to hold this one to braze it. I took the second ring, which will be for the other end, and put it inside the tube to hold it. I'll just put this in here so it rests like so. Put that one like that. Push everything down flat, and we're good to go. Got to keep giving it a test. See if the base metal is hot enough to melt the rod. Not quite there yet. It's just starting now. There we go. Now we've got to heat that vertical joint. Awesome. And if you try heating the rod up directly with the flame, instead of letting it do it with the base metal, it'll just flake off. You gotta wait until it's ready. And if it helps, I've found if you actually try and scratch the metal a little bit with the rod, because I think part of what this process does is that bit of a scratch motion gets beneath that oxide layer we talked about. And once you get underneath that, the metals will adhere. Otherwise, you're just fighting that oxide layer. And that's it. And let's let it cool, and then I'll give you a close-up and show you what the joint looks like. And here you can see what the finished braze joint looks like. Very similar to copper when you sweat copper. You can see how the toe of the braze joint, it's wetted out really good into the aluminum top and bottom. Some of my spots were better than others. That one's better, that one's not quite as much. This one over here is fairly decent, that one's a little gloppy. But for the most part, it wets out pretty good top and bottom on most places, and it is pretty strong. So I think the rating is like, what's the tensile strength? Somewhere around, I think it's 30,000. So for what it is, it's not bad. And it's easier for pretty much anybody to do. And next we'll make up the next joint. So now I've got this piece clamped in the vise. I've got 2 aluminum strips in the vise to protect the tube that's already been brazed, and then that sets the depth so that we know it's going to be flush top and bottom. Now we'll braze that joint there. Right now I'm still preheating the metal. When you see me just dabbing at the metal, that's how I test it to see if it's ready to melt. Unfortunately, the way I had to clamp it, the vise was absorbing a lot of the heat that I was trying to get into the aluminum. The aluminum radiates its heat really well. It makes it difficult sometimes. Unfortunately, when you have to heat it that much, the aluminum oxides start to become more active, and it's going to start to give me trouble. Generally speaking, the least amount of heat that you put into the part that's necessary to do the job, the better. That spot I just dabbed on there, you can see it's starting to ball up. That's the oxide getting in the way, not letting it adhere to the base metal. The oxides weren't a problem in all areas, just in some of them. That's why I'm using this stainless steel brush to help brush that away and mix both of the metals. Now that it appears I've got the metals to wet in somewhat, I tried reheating it and applying more brazing metal. to position this one when we braze it, I've got everything assembled up into this tube so it'll hold it parallel into position. And that's the last braze joint.